Over the last couple of years, I've been interested in emulating the look of film in my own projects, shot on modern digital cameras like the one I'm using right now. I want to stir up that kind of nostalgic, timeless, soft memory feeling that you get when you watch something that was shot on celluloid. So I was really pleasantly surprised when Dehancer reached out to me and wanted to know if I would do an honest review of their Film Emulation plugin. Now, I've had my eye on Dehancer for a while. There's other film emulation plugins out there. I've heard Dehancer Pro is like really good, but it's $400. So I was pretty stoked to try this out. Now, this plugin works for Premiere Pro, After Effects, Final Cut Pro, and Davinci. And that's the Davinci free version and the studio version. I checked with Dehancer on that. But before I dive into the actual plugin, I wanted to know, what kind of cameras could I use this plugin with? Like, is this gonna be any good for me if I'm working with an old 8-bit camera, or do I need something that's raw or something that can do log? So the opening clips you saw were shot with this camera, the Lumix S5, and they were shot in 10-bit. I wanted to shoot something with a really old camera. So this is the Lumix GH2. This camera is over 12 years old now. It's 8-bit. So here's some clips shot on this GH2 that I've graded with Dehancer. And I think it looks pretty great. Obviously it looks a little bit different than Lumix S5, as you would expect it would. It's a 1080 camera and I'm using just the puny little kit lens that it came with. Okay, so now let's look at the plugin. All right, I've got my shot from my little 8-bit GH2, and I'm gonna drop the Dehancer node here in the color tab in Davinci. Now, this camera isn't logged, so I would just leave it as it is with Rec 709, but if it were, this is where you would select your camera's profile. Now, when you first drop Dehancer onto the node, the first thing you might think is, why does this look so blue? This threw me off the first couple clips I tried it on. And the reason for this is that by default, Dehancer applies this Kodak Vision 3 250D film look, but if you just disable it, you can see our clip goes back to normal. I've personally been loving the Kodak 3 200T stock, and then there's this Cinestill 800T, which I'm going to use in this example. Dehancer has 63 different film stocks to choose from here, so there's so many possibilities for looks, which is amazing. One tool I want to point out that really comes in handy in this case is film compression. This will help roll off highlights, which is really helpful for a camera like this that doesn't have the greatest dynamic range. Next, I'm going to print here. Now, I'm going to be honest, this is a little over my head and I'm still learning, but basically this is mimicking the optical printing that would happen at the end of an analog production. The Kodak and Fujifilm ones have this look that's probably actually more accurate to real film, but I think I prefer the more subtle look of this Kodak glossy paper. Now, there's a lot more here to play with, but this isn't a tutorial, so I'm just going to highlight some standout effects. So first we've got grain, and Dehancer's grain is magical. It's not just your typical digital grain, which is just an overlay. In analog film, the image is made entirely up of grain. So to mimic this effect, Dehancer has an algorithm that generates grain based on local color and brightness characteristics of the image, so it's always related with it. And this makes a huge difference in the look it gives. Dehancer defaults to 35mm, but there's also 8mm, 16mm, and 65mm, and then there's different ISOs you can choose within those, or you can just use no grain at all. And then we've got halation, which are those gorgeous red-orange halos that can appear in bright spots on the edges. And they can also have a more subtle effect on skin tone. And you can customize this to be more or less subtle, which I love because looking back at some of my past film emulation, I think my halation was a little bit too in your face. Next we've got bloom, which adds a nice sort of soft glow around bright spots, which also affects the halation. And then there's gate weave, which mimics that little bit of jitter from the film strip being pulled through the frame of a camera or projector. I love the little extra breath of life this gives, especially to title cards and static shots. Overall, what I really love about Dehancer is just how subtle or not subtle you can go with the look. You can make your shot look like a scratched up 8mm home movie, or you could keep your project more modern with no grain or effects at all and just get the benefit of the amazing color and looks of Dehancer. Now, one interesting thing with film emulation that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about is how it could be used to help you sell your VFX a little bit more. With composited images, it's nice to have this final layer that kind of marries everything together, especially adding that grain and that softness to help take away the digital elements of your shot. So in the opening shots, I added these statues in this digital fog in Davinci. And I do think that Dehancer is helping tie that all together. Okay, so after playing around with Dehancer for 2 or 3 weeks now, here's my conclusions. I'm gonna start with the pros. Almost everything. I especially love the grain, the bloom, the gate weave, the halation. And I think the best thing about Dehancer for me is that you can get to a really good film emulation look really fast. And as somebody who has to juggle a lot of different aspects of a film production, VFX and sound and editing, you don't have as much time as you'd like for the coloring if you have like a deadline you're trying to meet. And so I think Dehancer is really great at getting to a good look fast, but you can also spend as much time as you want tweaking because there is so many possibilities there with all the different film looks. Okay, so let's move on to the cons. There's 2 main cons for me with Dehancer, and the first one really isn't that big of a deal, but the first one's the playback speed. You can't get real-time playback if you're using effects like grain. For me, this isn't a big deal using Davinci Resolve because I can simply hit Shift-D and just turn all the color grading effects off and then it'll play back totally normal. But that can be a little distracting to watch if you shoot in log, because log just looks so incredibly different. So ways you could combat that is to create a separate node for like the grain and halation and bloom, and then a separate node for just like the color and contrast and all that look aspect of it. And then you can just turn the grain off if you want to have real-time playback. To me, that's a little bit of extra work compared to just hitting Shift-D, but it's definitely a solution. The good news is that it does render pretty quickly, at least for me. I am using a machine with a 3070 in it, but I would say it's almost at playback speed, maybe slightly slower than playback speed. So really not an issue as far as rendering goes. Okay, so the second con, which is probably the bigger deal for most of us, is the price. That's not to say that Dehancer isn't worth it. You get what you pay for, and that's something I've learned over the years. There's certain pieces of equipment I've bought that after a year or two I realize, if I would have just spent a little bit more money, I would have had something that didn't break or was missing this really important feature that I use all the time. If you're just starting out, you're brand new to filmmaking, you don't have no budget, I wouldn't get this at this stage. But if you're a little bit further along, you actually understand a little bit more about color now, or you're just wanting to get into coloring, then I think this could be a really good choice. I need to interrupt myself real quick here. I was referring to Dehancer Pro when I was talking about the price point here. However, one thing I didn't explore was Dehancer Lite. I think if you're specifically a Davinci user and can't afford the Pro version, the Lite version becomes very interesting. This is because the Lite version includes a lot of the features from Pro, including the grain, bloom, and the 63 film profiles. However, 2 big things you'd be missing are the halation and gate weave. But you could use Davinci's halation effect if you've got the studio version, or try to create the effect yourself with a tutorial. I did find it pretty hard to make it look as good and as natural as Dehancer's halation, but I don't know how much an average audience member would really notice that. And to mimic the gate weave, you could use a camera shake effect with a fast speed and a small scale. Now obviously you're still missing out on features like some of the prints and lots of helpful slider sections like film compression and the film developer, and those really help you dial in the look you want. And of course, you're also missing out on the convenience and the speed factor, which is maybe the best part of Dehancer Pro. But if you're broke and you're willing to put extra time in to get the look, I think this could get you reasonably close and save you 250 bucks on a lifetime subscription for Pro. I'm gonna be using this thing for years to come. I love it. Thank you, Dehancer, for sending this to me. And if you want to get 10% off of Dehancer, you can use my code UnseenPixels at checkout and support me as I'm working on my new secret film project. Thank you guys for sticking around and watching this. I really appreciate the support. And yeah, I have new stuff in the works, and that's all I'm going to say for now, but more soon.